The unwanted exist only to be forgotten. That's what every wolf in the Iron Peak pack had made clear to Isolde since the day Beta Zarek first called her dead weight. But on the night the great hibernal storm turned the mountain air to glass, when she hauled 12 frozen wolves through her cabin door, she would discover that compassion was the most dangerous strength of all, and the one that would make kings kneel. The cold didn't just bite. It devoured. Isolde pressed her trembling hands against the failing wood stove, watching her breath crystallize in the air. Outside, the storm had transformed her cabin into a tomb of ice, each gust of wind driving frozen needles through the gaps in the warped timber. The pack was safe behind stone walls half a mile away, warm and fed. She was here because Alpha Gorman had decided an Omega wasn't worth the space. "Let the frost take what we cannot use," Zarek had said, his eyes empty of remorse. She should have been thinking of survival. Rationing the 3 logs left. Sealing the door. Instead, she heard it, a desperate rhythmic scratching that clawed through the howling wind. Not one sound. Many. Frantic. Dying. Isolde's fingers found the frozen latch. Every instinct screamed to conserve what little warmth remained. Opening that door meant inviting death inside. But she had spent 10 years invisible, 10 years swallowing the pack's cruelty like poison. If she was going to freeze, she would do it on her terms. The door swung open, and 12 massive shapes collapsed across her threshold, their orange eyes flickering like embers about to die. They were too large to be ordinary wolves. Even half dead from the frost, their bodies took up every inch of her cabin floor, a tangle of ice-matted fur and labored breathing. Isolde slammed the door against the wind and dropped to her knees beside the nearest one, her hands already working to brush away the snow that had frozen to its muzzle. She didn't think. Thinking meant acknowledging that she had just condemned herself. The wood stove sputtered, its heat barely enough for 1 person, let alone 13. Isolde fed it her last 2 logs anyway, then grabbed the threadbare blanket from her cot and began rubbing warmth into the closest wolf's limbs. Its silver fur was coarse beneath her fingers, muscles rigid with cold. She moved to the next, and the next, her own body shaking violently as the cabin's meager heat stretched thin. The largest wolf lay in the center of the mass, unmoving except for the shallow rise and fall of its chest. Its coat was darker than the others, charcoal streaked with black, and when its eyes cracked open, they burned with an amber intensity that made her breath catch. Not orange like dying embers. Molten gold. Isolde couldn't look away. She stumbled to the stove and retrieved the dented pot that held her last meal, a watery broth made from bone scraps and wild onion. It wasn't enough for 1 person, let alone 12 wolves. But she had already chosen this path. She poured the broth into her only bowl and carried it to the dark wolf, kneeling beside its massive head. "I don't know if you can understand me," she whispered, her voice hoarse from disuse. "But you need to drink." The wolf's eyes tracked her movements with an awareness that sent a shiver down her spine. Not animal instinct. Recognition. When she tilted the bowl to its muzzle, it drank slowly, deliberately, as if savoring not just the warmth but the act itself. She gave what remained to the others, a mouthful each, knowing it wouldn't be enough. The storm howled louder, and the cabin walls groaned under the weight of accumulating ice. The stove's fire dimmed to coals. Isolde wrapped herself around the nearest wolves, sharing what little body heat she had left, and felt their breathing begin to steady. The dark wolf shifted closer, its body radiating an impossible warmth that didn't match its half-frozen state. Its eyes never left her face. "Who are you?" she breathed. The wolf didn't answer. But in the dying light of the fire, Isolde could have sworn she saw something flicker across its features. Not gratitude. Recognition. As if it had been searching for her, and had finally, impossibly, found what it was looking for. Outside, the storm screamed. Inside, 12 strangers slept. And Isolde, who had been forgotten by her own pack, realized she was no longer alone. Dawn came without fanfare, a pale gray light that barely penetrated the frost-covered windows. Isolde woke to silence. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world encased in ice. She tried to move and found herself pinned beneath warm, heavy bodies. The wolves had surrounded her in the night, their combined heat the only reason she hadn't frozen. The dark wolf was gone. In its place knelt a man. Isolde's breath stopped. He was bare-chested despite the cold, his skin marked with silver scars that caught the dim light like frozen rivers. Dark hair fell past his shoulders, and those same molten gold eyes studied her with an intensity that made her want to disappear into the floorboards. He was beautiful in the way winter storms were beautiful, dangerous, vast, and utterly unforgiving. "You're awake." His voice was low, rough from disuse or perhaps from the cold. Not a question. A statement. Behind him, the other wolves began to shift. Isolde scrambled backward as bodies twisted and reformed, fur receding to reveal men and women in various states of undress. Warriors, all of them. Their bodies were honed weapons, even weakened by the frost. They moved with coordinated precision, forming a protective half-circle around the dark-haired man. "Please," Isolde managed, her voice cracking. "I didn't know, I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to save our lives?" The man rose to his full height, and Isolde had to tilt her head back to meet his gaze. He towered over her, easily 6.5 feet of controlled power. "Or you didn't mean to sacrifice your own survival for 12 strangers?" One of the female warriors stepped forward, her auburn hair still damp from the shift. "My lord, she bears the Omega mark. Iron Peak, from the scent." The man's expression darkened. "Iron Peak." He crouched before Isolde, bringing those burning eyes level with hers. "Where is your pack, Omega? Why were you alone in this death trap while the storm raged?" Isolde's throat constricted. She couldn't tell him the truth. Couldn't admit that her own alpha had abandoned her to freeze because feeding her through winter was a waste of resources. Shame burned hotter than the fear. "They're safe," she whispered. "In the fortress." "And they left you here?" Not a question this time either. His jaw tightened, a muscle jumping beneath the skin. "What's your name?" "Isolde. Isolde Vane." "Isolde." He said it carefully, as if testing the weight of it. Then he did something that made her world tilt sideways. He bowed his head. Not a full bow, but an acknowledgement that no one, had ever given her before. "My name is Ryan Sterling. I am the Lycan King of the Great Northern Reach, and you, Isolde Vane, have saved the lives of my high guard and myself." The cabin seemed to shrink around his words. Lycan King. The ruler of the Northern Territories, the one whose laws governed a dozen packs, whose power was said to rival the old gods. And she had fed him broth made from bone scraps. "I don't understand," Isolde breathed. "Why were you out in the storm? Why didn't you shift before?" "We were ambushed. Poisoned with wolfsbane before we could defend ourselves." His expression was carved from stone. "We ran as far as our wolf forms could carry us before the cold took us. I have ruled for 2 centuries, Omega. I have seen warriors face death without flinching. But I have never witnessed an Omega choose mercy over survival. Your pack calls you weak." Isolde couldn't speak. Couldn't move. Ryan Sterling stood and extended his hand. "They are fools." Isolde stared at his outstretched hand, calloused and scarred, offered to her as if she were worth touching. As if she mattered. She was reaching for it when the cabin groaned. It wasn't the wind. The sound came from deep within the structure itself, a low, tortured creak that made every warrior in the room go still. Ryan's hand snapped closed around her wrist and yanked her to her feet just as the first crack split the air. "Out. Now." His command cut through the rising panic. The auburn-haired warrior was already at the door, wrenching it open against the weight of packed snow. Daylight flooded in, blindingly white, revealing a world transformed into a crystalline tomb. Ice had accumulated on the roof throughout the night, tons of it, bending the ancient support beams past their breaking point. Another crack. Louder. Wood splintered somewhere above them. Formation. Ryan's voice carried the weight of centuries of command. The High Guard moved as one entity, warriors flanking the door in perfect synchronization. But Ryan didn't move. His body shifted, placing itself between Isolde and the failing ceiling. "You need to go," Isolde said, trying to pull away from his grip. "I'll slow you down." Not negotiable. His eyes blazed gold, and for a moment she saw the wolf beneath the man, ancient and absolutely unwilling to abandon what it had claimed as pack. The ceiling exploded inward. Ryan moved faster than thought, spinning Isolde into his chest as timber and ice crashed down around them. His arms locked around her, one hand cradling her head, his body curved over hers like a shield. The impact drove him to his knees, but he didn't let go, didn't even flinch. She felt the shudder that ran through him as something heavy struck his back, heard his sharp intake of breath, but his grip only tightened. Shield wall. The Auburn warrior's voice rang out. Through the chaos of falling debris, Isolde saw them. The High Guard had formed a living barrier at the door, their bodies pressed shoulder to shoulder, arms raised to deflect the ice and wood that threatened to bury the entrance. They held the line without hesitation, creating a corridor through the destruction. Move. Ryan hauled Isolde to her feet and half-carried, half-dragged her toward the door. The cabin was collapsing in earnest now, the walls buckling inward, the floor tilting at a sickening angle. She stumbled and his arms swept beneath her knees, lifting her against his chest as if she weighed nothing. He ran. The world became a blur of white and motion. The High Guard peeled away from the door as Ryan burst through, their formation collapsing inward to follow. Behind them, the cabin gave its final death rattle and folded in on itself, sending up a plume of snow and shattered wood that painted the morning air gray. Ryan didn't stop until they were 50 yards clear. Only then did he set Isolde down, his hands lingering on her shoulders as he scanned her for injuries. Blood ran down his back from where a beam had struck him, dark against his pale skin, but his focus remained entirely on her. "Are you hurt?" Isolde shook her head, unable to find words. The cabin, her prison, her shelter, the only home she'd known for 10 years, was gone. Erased. And this man, this king, had taken a blow meant for her without hesitation. The Auburn warrior appeared at Ryan's side, already tearing strips from her own clothing to bind his wound. "My lord, we need to move. The noise will have carried." Agreed. Ryan's jaw tightened, his gaze shifting to the tree line. "If Iron Peak sends scouts, I want distance between us and this place." He looked down at Isolde, and something in his expression softened. "Can you walk?" She should say yes. Should tell him she didn't need help, didn't need protection. But her legs were shaking, and the cold was already seeping through her inadequate clothing. The truth lodged in her throat. Ryan read her silence and simply nodded. "Then I'll carry you." He lifted her again, settling her against his chest with a gentleness that contradicted every story she'd ever heard about Lycan Kings. The High Guard formed around them, a moving shield of bodies and watchful eyes. And as they began their march into the frozen wilderness, Isolde realized something that terrified her more than the collapsing cabin. She had become something worth protecting. They made it 2 miles before Isolde's body began to fail. Ryan felt it first, the way her shivering intensified, then suddenly stopped. The way her skin went from cold to ice. He halted mid-stride, and the High Guard froze with him, their eyes tracking his every movement as he lowered Isolde to the snow. Her lips had gone blue. Her breathing was shallow, erratic. The thin dress she wore might as well have been paper against the frigid air. He'd been a fool to think carrying her would be enough, that his body heat alone could sustain her through the frozen wasteland. "How long?" the Auburn warrior asked quietly. "Minutes." Ryan's jaw clenched. "Maybe less." Around them, the guard formed a protective circle, their backs to their king, eyes scanning the white expanse for threats. They knew what was coming. They'd seen it before, centuries ago, when the old laws still held weight. The blood rite. The forbidden binding that no Lycan King had performed in a millennium. Ryan pulled Isolde against his chest, cradling her like something precious and breakable. Her eyes fluttered open, unfocused, pupils blown wide. "Stay with me," he commanded, and even dying, her body tried to obey. He bit into his own wrist, deep enough that blood welled hot and fast. The scent of it filled the air, ancient, powerful, carrying the weight of his bloodline. He pressed the wound to her lips. "Drink, Isolde. Drink or die." She was too far gone to understand, but instinct took over. Her mouth closed around the wound and she pulled weakly, then stronger as the first drops hit her tongue. Ryan felt the connection snap into place like a physical thing, a golden thread that lashed from his chest to hers, binding them in ways that transcended pack law and reason. The blood rite wasn't just a transfusion of power. It was a promise. A claiming. It meant his life force would sustain hers, that his strength would become her strength, that their souls would be tethered until death severed the bond. Isolde gasped and pulled away, her back arching as his vitality flooded through her. Her eyes snapped open. No longer the dull brown of an omega but brilliant, burning gold. The change rippled through her body like wildfire. Her muscles seized, reforming, strengthening. Her bones cracked and realigned with a sound that made even the High Guard wince. She screamed. Ryan held her through it, his arms iron bands around her thrashing form. I know it hurts. But you're not dying. You're becoming. The transformation took minutes but felt like hours. When it finally released her, Isolde collapsed against him, gasping, her entire body trembling with new strength. She looked up at him with those impossible golden eyes, and he saw the moment she understood what he'd done. You bonded me, she whispered, her voice raw. The blood rite. That's forbidden. You were dying. You've made me High Lycan. Horror and wonder warred across her face. Your vitality is tied to mine. If I die, you won't. His voice carried absolute certainty. Not while I draw breath. Isolde stared at him, this king who had given her more in 3 days than her pack had in 10 years. Power. Protection. A bond that made her untouchable by anyone except him. She should have been terrified. Instead, she felt the golden thread between them humming with purpose, and realized that for the first time in her life, she belonged to something that wanted her. Why? The question broke from her lips. Ryan's thumb traced her jaw, a gesture so gentle it made her ache. Because mercy deserves mercy, Isolde Vane. And I protect what's mine. They moved faster after the blood rite, Isolde's new strength carrying her through snow that would have swallowed her hours before. She could feel Ryan's vitality coursing through her veins like liquid fire, sharpening her senses until she could hear the whisper of wind through distant pines, smell the difference between fresh snow and old ice. The world had transformed from muted grays to vivid, overwhelming clarity. The Auburn warrior, Captain Sarah, she'd learned, kept pace beside her, watching with approval as Isolde navigated the terrain without stumbling. You're adapting quickly. Most humans would still be unconscious from the transformation. I don't feel human anymore, Isolde admitted, flexing fingers that now ended in claws she could summon at will. You're not. You're High Lycan now. Second only to. Sarah stopped mid-sentence, her head snapping toward the eastern ridge. The entire guard halted as one, their bodies going rigid with alertness. Ryan's hand found the small of Isolde's back. We have company. They emerged from the tree line like shadows given form. 6 wolves, each bearing the iron-gray markings of her old pack. At their center walked 2 men in human form, and Isolde's blood turned to ice that had nothing to do with the temperature. Alpha Gorman and Beta Zerek. Gorman's lips curved into a smile that never reached his eyes. He was a broad man, thick with muscle gone soft at the edges, his face weathered by cruelty rather than age. Well, the dead Omega lives. His gaze slid to Ryan, and something like recognition flickered there. And she's found herself a protector. How touching. Alpha Gorman. Ryan's voice was glacial. Interesting place for a patrol. These are my lands. I patrol where I please. Gorman's attention returned to Isolde, and she felt the weight of his alpha command building in the air like pressure before a storm. Omega, come here. The compulsion hit her like a physical blow, the ingrained obedience of 10 years rising to drag her forward. But beneath it, something else surged, Ryan's vitality, burning gold and absolutely immovable. The command shattered against it like water against stone. Isolde stayed exactly where she was. Gorman's smile vanished. I said come here. She heard you, Ryan said softly. She simply doesn't obey you anymore. Zerek stepped forward, his hand moving to the blade at his hip. You dare interfere with pack law? She belongs to Iron Peak. She belongs to herself. Isolde's voice rang out before she could stop it, stronger than she'd ever heard it, carrying an edge that made even Gorman's scouts flinch. And if you want to challenge that, Beta, then come forward. Let's see if dead weight can fight back. The words hung in the frozen air. Zarek's face darkened, and he drew his blade, a cruel, jagged thing meant for carving, not clean killing. He moved fast, faster than a human could track, closing the distance between them in a heartbeat. Isolde moved faster. She didn't think, didn't plan. Her body simply knew what to do, the Bloodright's gift singing through her muscles as she sidestepped his strike and drove her palm into his chest. The impact sent Zarek flying backward 10 feet to crash into the snow, gasping, the blade spinning from his grip. Silence. Isolde stared at her hand, at the claws that had extended without conscious thought, at the strength that had felt as natural as breathing. She'd never fought back. Never even imagined she could. And now Zarek lay in the snow, staring up at her with something she'd never seen directed at her before. Fear. Gorman's expression had gone carefully blank. You've bonded her. It wasn't a question. The Bloodright. That makes her High Lycan. That makes her untouchable, Ryan finished, moving to stand beside Isolde. By law, by right, and by my decree. She is under my protection, Gorman. And if you or your pack make any attempt to reclaim her, I will consider it an act of war against the Northern Reach. The Alpha's jaw worked, rage and calculation warring behind his eyes. Finally, he jerked his head at his scouts. Retreat. They melted back into the trees, Zarek stumbling after them, still clutching his chest. But Gorman paused at the tree line, his gaze finding Isolde one last time. This isn't over, Omega. No, Isolde agreed, her golden eyes blazing. It's not. But next time, don't send your Beta. Come yourself. Gorman vanished into the shadows, and Isolde felt Ryan's hand settle on her shoulder, warm and grounding. Well fought, he murmured. She was shaking, adrenaline and disbelief coursing through her. She'd just challenged an Alpha, beaten his Beta, survived. And for the first time in her life, she understood that survival wasn't the same as living. She was done merely surviving. Ethelgard rose from the mountain like something carved by gods rather than hands. The citadel's obsidian walls caught the late afternoon light and threw it back in shards of violet and silver, spires reaching so high they disappeared into the clouds. Isolde had heard stories of the Lycan capital, every wolf had, but stories were pale shadows compared to the reality that sprawled before her. The gates opened before they reached them, massive slabs of black iron that moved in perfect silence. Warriors lined the path beyond, hundreds of them, their armor polished to mirror brightness. As Ryan passed, they struck their fists to their chests in salute, a sound like thunder rolling through stone corridors. Isolde tried to make herself smaller, to slip into the background the way she'd learned to do in Iron Peak. But Ryan's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers with casual possessiveness, and kept her at his side. Walk with your head up, he murmured, so quietly only she could hear. You are High Lycan now. You bow to no one but me. The words should have felt like a chain. Instead, they felt like permission. They entered the great hall, and Isolde's breath caught. The ceiling soared 3 stories overhead, held aloft by columns carved to resemble ancient trees, their branches intertwining to form a canopy of stone leaves. Torches burned in silver sconces, their light reflecting off walls inlaid with precious metals that formed intricate patterns. The history of the Lycan people, written in gold and bronze and steel. A woman approached, her silver hair braided with threads of ice-blue silk, her bearing regal despite the simple cut of her gown. She bowed to Ryan, a shallow dip of respect between equals, then turned her attention to Isolde. My king, you've brought a guest. Her voice carried the melodic lilt of centuries, and her eyes, pale gray like winter dawn, assessed Isolde with keen intelligence. And bonded her, I see. How unexpected. Lady Marin, this is Isolde Vane. Isolde, Lady Marin serves as keeper of the citadel and my chief advisor. Ryan's tone held warmth reserved for old friends. She'll see to your accommodations. Marin's expression softened as she studied Isolde more closely, taking in the too-thin frame, the dress that was more patches than fabric, the way Isolde still held herself like she expected a blow. Understanding flickered across the older woman's face, and with it, something that looked like anger. Iron Peak, Marin said quietly. It wasn't a question. Isolde nodded, unable to find her voice. Then you've had a long journey in more ways than one. Marin extended her hand, palm up, an offer rather than a demand. Come, child. Let me show you what hospitality actually means. The rooms Marin led her to made Isolde want to weep. They weren't chambers. They were a suite, a sitting room with furniture upholstered in deep burgundy, a bedroom with a bed large enough for 4 people, and a bathing room with a copper tub already steaming with heated water. Servants appeared bearing armfuls of clothing, soft fabrics in rich colors that Isolde had only ever seen on alphas. This is too much, Isolde whispered, running her fingers over a dress of midnight blue velvet. I can't. You can and you will. Marin's tone brooked no argument. You are the king's bonded. That makes you second in rank only to him. These rooms are yours by right. She paused, then added more gently, and even if you weren't bonded, any wolf who saved our king's life would be honored. You are owed this, Isolde. All of it. Isolde sank onto the edge of the bed, her legs suddenly unable to hold her. 10 years. 10 years of sleeping on a cot that smelled of mildew, of eating scraps, of being told she was lucky to have a roof at all. And now this. Rooms that felt like a palace. Clothes that didn't have holes. People who looked at her and saw someone worth honoring. I don't know how to be this person, she admitted, the words escaping before she could stop them. Marin sat beside her, the mattress barely dipping under her weight. Then you'll learn. And we'll teach you. She reached out and tucked a strand of Isolde's silver-blonde hair behind her ear, the gesture achingly maternal. The Lycan guard already speaks of you with reverence. They say you shared your last meal with the king when you had every reason to let him die. They say you chose mercy when survival demanded cruelty. That is not weakness, child. That is the rarest form of strength. A knock at the door interrupted them. A young guard entered, bowing deeply. Lady Marin, the king requests Lady Isolde's presence in the council chamber. Alpha Gorman has been summoned. Isolde's blood ran cold. Already. She'd barely had time to catch her breath, and already Gorman was here, ready to reclaim her or destroy her or both. Marin rose, her expression hardening into something fierce and protective. Then we'd best not keep him waiting. But first, she gestured to the servants, who immediately moved forward with the midnight blue dress. You will face your old Alpha as what you are now. Not an Omega. Not dead weight. But high Lycan, bonded to the king, and utterly beyond his reach. As the servants helped her into the dress, as they braided her hair with silver thread and fastened a cloak of wolf fur around her shoulders, Isolde caught her reflection in the mirror. Golden eyes stared back at her from a face she barely recognized. Strong. Regal. Unbroken. She looked like someone who could face Alpha Gorman and not flinch. She looked like someone who could win. The council chamber was a cathedral of power. Circular walls rose to a domed ceiling painted with constellations that seemed to move in the torchlight, mapping territories and bloodlines across the northern reach. 12 thrones carved from different woods ringed the chamber, one for each of the high lords who governed the Lycan territories. At the north point, elevated above the rest, sat Ryan's throne, black walnut inlaid with silver that caught the light like captured moonlight. Ryan stood before it rather than sitting, his presence filling the space with barely leashed authority. He'd changed into formal attire, black leather and silver clasps that marked him as king, but his eyes remained the same molten gold that had watched Isolde feed him bone broth in a freezing cabin. Those eyes found her as she entered with Lady Marin, and something in his posture relaxed infinitesimally. Stand beside me, he said, and it was not a request. Isolde climbed the steps to the dais, her new dress whispering against stone, and took her place at Ryan's right hand. From this vantage, she could see the entire chamber, the high lords filing in to take their seats, their expressions ranging from curious to calculating. These were the wolves who shaped law, who decided the fates of entire packs. And she stood above them, bonded to their king. The massive doors at the southern entrance swung open with a boom that echoed like judgment. Alpha Gorman entered as if he owned the space. He walked with the swagger of a wolf who'd never been challenged, never been denied, flanked by Beta Zerek and 4 of his largest warriors. His gaze swept the chamber, taking in the assembled High Lords with barely concealed disdain, before landing on Ryan. He bowed. Shallow. Perfunctory. The bare minimum that protocol demanded. My king. I came as summoned, though I confess I'm uncertain what matter requires the council's attention. His tone suggested this was all a waste of his valuable time. The matter of attempted murder. Ryan's voice was quiet, but it carried to every corner of the chamber. The crime of abandonment. The systematic abuse of pack members under your protection. Gorman's expression didn't flicker. Strong accusations. I assume you have evidence. I have a witness. Only then did Gorman's gaze slide to Isolde, and for a fraction of a heartbeat, she saw shock ripple across his features. Shock at seeing her alive. Shock at seeing her standing beside the Lycan King, dressed in velvet and silver, her eyes burning gold instead of the dull brown of submission. The shock vanished beneath a sneer. The Omega. He said it like a curse. My king, surely you don't intend to bring charges based on the testimony of an Omega? They're unreliable at best, manipulative at worst. She probably spun you some tragic tale to gain your sympathy. She saved my life. Ryan's words cut through Gorman's speech like a blade through silk. She and 12 members of my High Guard were left to die in the great hibernal storm while your pack sheltered in warmth and safety. When we collapsed at her door, poisoned and freezing, she used her last resources to keep us alive. So yes, Alpha Gorman, I intend to bring charges. And I intend to let her speak. Gorman's jaw tightened, but he recovered quickly, spreading his hands in a gesture of false reasonableness. If the Omega survived the storm, then clearly my decision to leave her in the cabin was sound. She's resourceful. Hardly abandonment. You told her to freeze. Isolde's voice rang out before she could stop herself, before fear could choke the words back. Beta Zerek said I was dead weight. That feeding me through winter was a waste of resources. You locked the fortress gates and left me in a cabin you knew wouldn't survive the storm. The ravings of a desperate Omega. Gorman's tone was dismissive, but his eyes had gone cold and calculating. You're confused, girl. The storm was unexpected. We made the best decision we could. You made the decision that I was expendable. Isolde descended 2 steps, her hands clenched at her sides, 10 years of swallowed rage finally finding its voice. You've made that decision every day for a decade. Scraps for meals. A cabin that leaked. Work that broke my body while you called it mercy that you let me live at all. And when the storm came, you saw your chance to erase the problem permanently. My king, Gorman turned to Ryan, his expression one of pained patience. Surely you can see she's been influenced by the bloodrite. The bond has confused her, made her believe. The bond has made her strong enough to tell the truth. Ryan's hand found Isolde's shoulder, a gesture of solidarity that sent a clear message to every wolf in the chamber. And you, Gorman, have made the mistake of thinking an Omega's voice doesn't matter. That stops now. Gorman's mask finally cracked, rage bleeding through the cracks. She's lying. She's nothing. An Omega without worth who should be grateful she was given shelter at all. He took a step forward, his alpha presence expanding to fill the room, trying to dominate through sheer force of will. And I will not stand here and let some worthless. Isolde met his eyes and didn't look away. For the first time in her life, when an alpha tried to make her small, she refused to shrink. The golden thread of the bloodrite hummed in her chest, Ryan's strength backing her own, and she stood her ground against the weight of Gorman's command. Then sit, she said softly. Because this trial is just beginning. The High Lords convened in perfect silence, their expressions carved from stone as they weighed the accusations before them. Lord Castellan, eldest of the council, leaned forward in his throne of ash wood, his silver beard braided with copper rings that marked centuries of service. These are grave charges, Alpha Gorman. Abandonment of pack members is a violation of the oldest laws. His voice carried the weight of eons. But Omega testimony has historically been considered unreliable. The bond between Omega and Alpha can create confusion, misplaced loyalty, even false memory. His gaze shifted to Isolde, not unkind but skeptical. How do we know you speak truth, girl? Before Isolde could answer, Gorman laughed. It was a sharp, ugly sound that echoed off the vaulted ceiling. You don't. Because she's lying. Omegas lie to survive, it's their nature. They manipulate, they twist facts to gain sympathy. He turned to face Isolde fully, his body radiating dominance. Tell them the truth, Omega. Tell them you begged to stay in that cabin. Tell them you preferred isolation because you couldn't handle pack life. The alpha command hit her like a hammer. It was different from the compulsion in the snow. This was full force, backed by years of conditioning, designed to shatter will and replace it with obedience. Isolde felt her throat constrict, felt the words he wanted rising unbidden to her lips. But beneath the command, the blood-right burned. Ryan's vitality surged through her veins, a golden fire that met Gorman's dominance and simply refused. The command broke against it like waves against a cliff, and Isolde remained standing, her jaw clenched, her eyes blazing with defiant gold. No, she said, and the single word rang with more power than any speech. Gorman's face went white. Around the chamber, the High Lords shifted forward in their seats, suddenly riveted. I will not lie for you. Isolde's voice grew stronger with each word. Not anymore. Not ever again. She turned to address the council directly, forcing herself to meet their ancient eyes. For 10 years, I ate scraps while the pack feasted. I wore rags while others had furs. I was given the most dangerous tasks, hauling water from the frozen river, clearing ice from the fortress walls in storms, because if I died, it wouldn't matter. Because I was dead weight. That's not, Gorman started. Beta Zerek said those exact words to my face the night of the storm. Isolde cut him off, and the shock of being interrupted by an Omega left Gorman speechless. He said feeding me through winter was a waste of resources. He told me the cabin would be my tomb. And when I begged for shelter, Alpha Gorman stood behind him and smiled. Lord Castellan's expression had darkened. Is this true, Zerek? The Beta stood rigid, caught between loyalty and self-preservation. The Omega was a burden on pack resources. The Alpha made a practical decision. You admitted it. Lady Marin's voice cut through the chamber like a blade. She'd taken a seat among the High Lords, her status as keeper granting her council voice. You just confessed to abandonment. To deliberately leaving a pack member to die. Gorman's control was fracturing. She wasn't pack. She was Omega. There's a difference. There is no difference. Ryan's voice carried absolute authority, silencing every other sound in the chamber. Omega, Beta, Alpha, all are pack. All are protected under Lycan law. The hierarchy exists to create order, not to enable cruelty. He descended from the dais, moving to stand beside Isolde, his presence a wall of support at her back. You abandoned a member of your pack to death because it was convenient. Because you valued resources over life. That is not strength, Gorman. That is cowardice. The Alpha's composure shattered completely. You dare lecture me? You, who bonded an Omega out of sentiment. Who lets this worthless creature stand in a council chamber as if she has any right? I have every right. Isolde's shout echoed off stone, silencing Gorman mid-rant. Years of suppressed rage, of swallowed injustice, poured out in a torrent. I survived your cruelty. I survived your neglect. I survived the storm you sent me into. And when 12 wolves collapsed at my door, I saved them. Not because I expected reward. Not because I thought they'd save me back. But because it was right. Because mercy matters more than survival. Because I am not you. She took a step toward Gorman, and for the first time, he backed away. You called me worthless. Dead weight. A flaw in the bloodline. But I am standing here, High Lycan, bonded to a king, while you answer for your crimes. So tell me, Alpha Gorman, who was worthless all along? Silence flooded the chamber. Absolute. Suffocating. Lord Castellan rose from his throne, his expression grave. Alpha Gorman of Iron Peak. You have been accused of abandonment, systematic abuse, and attempted murder. The accused has confessed through his Beta. The victim has testified and resisted your alpha command, a feat impossible for one speaking falsehood. He looked to his fellow High Lords, and one by one, they nodded. We find you guilty. Your title is stripped. Your territory is forfeit. You are banished from the Northern Reach, effective immediately. Gorman staggered as if struck. You can't, this is. Guards. Ryan's command brought warriors flooding into the chamber. Remove him. And ensure he understands that if he ever returns, the sentence will be death. They dragged Gorman away, his protests fading into echoes. Isolde watched him go, feeling nothing but a vast hollow relief. The man who'd haunted her nightmares for a decade was gone. Powerless. Broken. And she was still standing. 3 days after Gorman's banishment, Ethelgard transformed into something from a dream. Silver banners bearing the ancient crest of the Northern Reach, a wolf crowned in stars, cascaded from every spire. The great amphitheater filled with wolves from across the territories, thousands of them, their collective presence a living tide of anticipation and curiosity. They had come to witness something that hadn't occurred in a millennium. The coronation of a Lycan queen. Isolde stood in her chambers, barely recognizing her reflection. The gown Lady Marin had commissioned was a masterwork of midnight blue silk and silver thread, the bodice embroidered with constellations that matched the council chamber ceiling. A cloak of white wolf fur draped her shoulders, fastened with a clasp of moonstones that caught the light like captured stars. Her silver-blonde hair had been braided with strands of platinum, woven into an intricate crown that made her look ancient and untouchable. You look like a queen, Marin said softly, adjusting the cloak with hands that weren't quite steady. You look like you were always meant for this. I'm terrified, Isolde admitted, her voice barely a whisper. Good. That means you understand the weight of what you're accepting. Marin's expression softened. But you've already proven yourself, child. You chose mercy when survival demanded cruelty. You stood before the High Lords and spoke truth to power. That's what makes a true queen, not birthright or bloodline, but the courage to do what's right when it costs everything. A knock at the door announced Captain Sarah, resplendent in ceremonial armor polished to mirror brightness. My lady, the king awaits. The amphitheater fell silent as Isolde entered. 10,000 eyes tracked her progress down the central aisle, wolves from every pack and territory watching as an Omega walked toward a throne. She could feel their emotions: skepticism, curiosity, hope. Some looked at her and saw weakness elevated above its station. Others saw possibility. Ryan stood at the center of the raised dais, crowned in silver that seemed to grow from his dark hair like moonlight made solid. His formal robes were black trimmed with platinum, and his eyes, those impossible golden eyes, found hers across the distance and held. Isolde climbed the steps and knelt before him, not in submission but in respect, her head bowed as tradition demanded. Ryan's voice carried across the amphitheater, amplified by ancient acoustics. Isolde Vane. You saved my life and the lives of my High Guard when you had every reason to let us perish. You proved that mercy is not weakness but the rarest form of strength. You stood before the High Lords and spoke truth that others feared to voice. You have shown yourself worthy of the highest honor I can bestow. He drew a crown from the velvet cushion beside his throne. Not silver like his own, but gold warm and radiant, set with amber stones that glowed like captured firelight. The crown of the queen, last worn so long ago that its existence had become legend. Do you accept this burden? Do you swear to protect the weak, to speak for the voiceless, to ensure that no wolf, regardless of rank, is ever abandoned to darkness? Isolde raised her head, meeting his gaze. I swear it. On my blood. On my bond. On everything I am and everything I will become. Ryan placed the crown on her head, and it settled like it had been made for her, like it had been waiting centuries for her to claim it. Then rise, Isolde Sterling, Lycan Queen of the Great Northern Reach. First of your name. Breaker of chains. Voice of the forgotten. She rose, and the amphitheater exploded into sound. Not just acceptance, celebration. Wolves howled their approval, the sound rising and rising until it seemed to shake the mountain itself. Among the crowd, Isolde saw Omegas weeping, their faces transformed by something she recognized intimately. Hope. Ryan took her hand, his fingers warm and solid around hers, and together they faced their people. For too long, he called out, his voice cutting through the din, we have allowed hierarchy to become cruelty. We have forgotten that strength without mercy is merely brutality. That changes today. Queen Isolde has my full authority to reform pack law, to investigate abuse, to ensure that every wolf, Omega, Beta, and Alpha alike, receives the protection they deserve. Isolde stepped forward, her voice strong despite the tremor in her hands. I was abandoned. I was told I was worthless, that my life meant nothing. But I stand here today because one act of mercy changed everything. She let her gaze sweep across the thousands of faces, finding the Omegas scattered throughout, the ones who understood exactly what her presence here meant. I vow to you now, no wolf will ever be left behind again. No voice will be silenced. No cruelty will be tolerated. And any Alpha who forgets that their pack is their sacred trust will answer to this crown. The howling intensified, and this time it wasn't just celebration. It was revolution. It was validation. It was the sound of 1,000 voices that had been silent for too long finally believing they might be heard. As the ceremony concluded and the festivities began, Ryan pulled Isolde close, his lips brushing her temple. Regrets. She thought of her cabin, of the frozen night, of the choice she'd made to open the door. She thought of how close she'd come to letting bitterness turn her cruel, to becoming what Gorman claimed she was, worthless and weak. None, she said, and meant it with every fiber of her being. This is exactly where I'm meant to be. Above them, the stars emerged in the darkening sky, the same constellations that marked her gown and Ryan's crown. And somewhere in the territories beyond, Isolde knew, Omegas were looking up at those same stars and believing, perhaps for the first time, that the world might change. That mercy might finally be stronger than cruelty. That even the forgotten could become queens. If you enjoyed this story, please subscribe to the channel for more werewolf romance tales, Alpha Kings, rejected mates, and powerful Omega stories. Hit the notification bell so you never miss an upload. Leave a comment below telling me what you thought of this story and what kind of werewolf stories you'd like to see next. Your support means everything and helps me create more content like this. Thank you for reading, and I'll see you in the next.